Thank you. The Committee on the Judiciary, Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties will come to order. Without objection, the chair, I'm authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. I welcome everyone to today's hearing. Citizens United at 10, Consequences for Democracy and Potential Responses by Congress. And I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the Supreme Court's deeply troubling decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. That decision has resulted in the corrosion of our democracy, giving a disproportionate weight to moneyed interests and drowning out the voices of ordinary Americans. Today's hearing will examine the extent of this corrosion and explore ways to repair the damage that the flood of dark money into our political system has wrought as a result of that decision. In Citizens United, the Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional a ban on corporations and unions using their general treasury funds to make independent expenditures, expressly advocating for the election or defeat of a candidate. Essentially, the court held, wrongly in my view, that this ban on independent expenditures violated corporations' First Amendment free speech rights. Citizens United represented an unjustified extension of Buckley versus Vallejo, Supreme Court decision in 1976 that had struck down limits on independent expenditures by individuals. In handing down its decision in Citizens United, the Supreme Court overturned decades-old precedents that held that the government could regulate outside spending by corporations and unions. The negative effect of Citizens United was immediately apparent. The same year that the Supreme Court decided Citizens United, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the U.S. District decided Speech Now Org versus FEC, striking down federal limitations on contributions by individuals to political committees that only made independent expenditures. Taken together, these two decisions resulted in the rise of the so-called super political action committees, or super PACs. Because of these decisions, individuals and corporations can make unlimited contributions to PACs dedicated only to making independent expenditures, whose donors' disclosure rules are much more opaque, allowing them to accumulate massive amounts of dark money. It's now 10 years later, and we're seeing the negative corrosive effects of a decade of permitting wealthy mega donors and corporations pouring unlimited amounts of money into our elections. Perhaps now more than ever, many Americans believe that their elected leaders do not care about them, that politicians only care about raising money, and the people that fund those super PACs that help get them elected. Prioritizing narrow interests to the money classes or corporations in the political system, people feel is rigged against them. They believe their voices will be drowned out come the election by the megaphones bought by dark money. Megaphones as if they are speech. Example after example shows they are right. For instance, most Americans, including most gun owners, support universal background checks for gun purchases. According to a 2018 Quinnipiac University poll, almost all Americans, including 97% of gun owners, support universal background checks. Despite the fact that enacting universal background checks would be overwhelmingly popular, the Grim Reaper, Senator also known as Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, has so far refused to take up H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, which the House passed nearly a year ago. Perhaps not surprisingly, since 2016, the National Rifle Association has spent more than $54 million on outside spending efforts, including $34 million raised from its dark money arm. That's a lot of money and has a big impact on who wins elections and influences the opinions on gun ownership. Similarly, Americans overwhelmingly support lowering prescription drug prices. According to the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation poll, more than 70% of Americans believe drug costs are unreasonable and that drug companies are putting profits before people. Similarly, a study conducted by Politico and the Harvard School of Public Health found that 92% of Americans favor lowering the rate for prescription drugs as an important health policy priority. Even President Trump, during his show of shows, also known as the State of the Union, address earlier this week in a speech that could otherwise best be described as a campaign rally, masquerading as a reality TV show, called on Congress to pass a bill to dramatically lower drug prices. Yet for years, Congress has done nothing. Why? It probably has something to do with pharmaceutical companies' army of lobbyists, backed up by massive amounts of dark money raised by allied super PACs. Sadly, I can name policy after policy area, from climate change to Wall Street regulations meant to avert another economic meltdown, where Americans overwhelmingly believe that Congress should take action. Yet Congress has failed to take such action when confronted by massive and targeted outside spending by dark money organizations. And the people that benefit from that are the leaders of the Senate and leaders of the House. And generally, they are not going to favor giving up a tool that gives them more power, particularly on the side that has the most money. The very real danger here is the American people, convinced that their voices will be drowned out by mega donors and corporate interests, will lose faith in the enterprise of self-government and indeed turn to demagogic and anti-democratic forces. It is for this reason that I support a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, while I'm a co-sponsor of H.J. Res. 2, the Democracy for All Amendment, and thank Chairman Representative Deutsch for working so hard on that for many, many years. Passing a constitutional amendment is one way to bring the dark age of the super PAC to a definitive close. But also urge Leader McConnell to take up H.R. 1 for the PEOPLE Act, which I believe Representative Sarbanes championed, which would enact reforms that would expose dark money donors. And I thank Representative Jayapal for all of her work on this issue as well, and she has another bill that goes a little further. Passing a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United should be our ultimate goal. In the meantime, however, Congress should take whatever action it can to stop the flow of dark money into our elections that threatens to erode even further the American people's faith in democratic self-government. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony, and I thank them all for appearing here and all the citizens that have been involved in this issue. And I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Johnson, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I know this is an issue that concerns a lot of Americans on both sides, and it will not surprise you that our side over here has a very different view of the issue. Before I get into my opening remarks, it's incumbent upon me to remind my good chairman here that it is a violation of House rules on decorum to refer to the majority leader of the other House as the Grim Reaper, even if he does so himself. We can't do it here. Okay, all right.
I'm out of order.
All right, you're out of order.
So ruled. Sustained. Overruled.
No objection. We believe the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, issued a decade ago, was based upon a long line of prior Supreme Court precedents and was in accordance with our proud constitutional history regarding the First Amendment. As the late Justice Scalia pointed out in his concurrence in Citizens United, the original meaning of the text of the First Amendment clearly supports the majority's decision. This is what he wrote, quote, "In 1791, as now, corporations could pursue only the objectives set forth in their charters, but the dissent provides no evidence that their speech in the pursuit of those objectives should be censured. Most of the founders' resentment towards corporations was directed at the state-granted monopoly privileges that individually chartered corporations enjoyed. Modern corporations don't have such privileges and would probably have been favored by most of our enterprising founders. The individual person's right to speak includes the right to speak in association with other individual persons. Surely the dissent does not believe that speech by the Republican Party or the Democratic Party can be censored because it is not the speech of an individual American. It is the speech of many individual Americans who have associated in a common cause, giving the leadership of the party the right to speak on their behalf. The First Amendment is written in terms of speech, not speakers. Its text offers no foothold for excluding any category of speaker, from single individuals to partnerships of individuals, to unincorporated associations of individuals, to incorporated associations of individuals," unquote. This is not just a conservative's view, as you know. The American Civil Liberties Union, which most Americans regard as a left or far left organization today, I do, seems generally supportive of the Citizens United decision. On its website today, you can find the following statement, quote, "In Citizens United, the Supreme Court ruled that independent political expenditures by corporations and unions are protected under the First Amendment and not subject to restriction by the government. Any rule that requires the government to determine what political speech is legitimate and how much political speech is appropriate is difficult to reconcile with the First Amendment. Our system of free expression is built on the premise that the people get to decide what speech they want to hear. It is not the role of government to make that decision for them. Unfortunately, legitimate concern over the influence of big money in politics has led some to propose a constitutional amendment to reverse the Citizens United decision. The ACLU will firmly oppose any constitutional amendment that would limit the free speech clause of the First Amendment." I don't find myself in agreement with the ACLU very often, but I think they got that one right. See, the ACLU and Justice Scalia appear to be on the same page, and that page is the parchment of our First Amendment. I suspect much of what we'll hear today at this hearing will be repetitions of the sorts of erroneous statements that none other than President Obama made about the Citizens United decision during his 2010 State of the Union address, in which he opined, quote, "The Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates of special interest, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections," unquote. Every clause of that sentence was incorrect. Citizens United didn't reverse a century of law. The Tillman Act of 1907 banned corporate donations to campaigns, and such donations remain banned. Citizens United overturned a 1990 precedent that allowed banning independent spending by corporations, which was itself a stark anomaly in our First Amendment law, as it was the only time the court had allowed a restriction on political speech for a reason other than a need to prevent corruption. Second, the, quote, "floodgates of special interest" weren't open. Instead, dams preventing the free flow of speech were removed. Now, we may not always like that speech, but that's what the First Amendment is about. As Professor Brad Smith, whom we'll hear from today, explained recently, quote, "The New York Times accused the justices in Citizens United of having paved the way for corporations to use their vast treasuries to overwhelm elections and thrust back to the robber baron era of the 19th century. A decade later, most spending comes from the same place it always has, and that is individuals who donate directly to candidates up to legally limited amounts. Corporations contribute well under 10% of federal political spending. Their voice is not dominant, and voters have a right to hear it. Third, and finally, Citizens United said nothing about foreign corporations spending in political campaigns. Indeed, in 2012, the Supreme Court explicitly upheld such restrictions in Blumen versus Federal Election Commission. Obviously, there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation and even, dare I say, fake news circulated about the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. But I expect at least part of today's discussion may help us correct those misinterpretations, and I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses here today. I want to apologize in advance before I yield back that a lot of us have multiple things going on this morning, so we may be in and out, but it is not a reflection on our view of the importance of this subject matter in this hearing. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now, Mr. Nadler is not present, but does he have a statement for the record he wants to introduce? No? Okay. But we thank Chairman Nadler for his participation in other ways. Now, Mr. Collins have a statement to enter? No? No? Also no. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for participating. Our first panel is going to be made up of members of Congress who've worked hard on this issue. I will introduce each witness, and after the introduction, I'll ask them for their testimony. Your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety, and you've got 5 minutes, and you know the rules on the 5 minutes and the lights. So, first witness is Representative Ted Deutsch. Representative Deutsch represents the 22nd Congressional District in the state of Florida. He's the chairman of the House Ethics Committee, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism, and a longtime member of this House Judiciary Committee. He is a co-sponsor, or the prime sponsor, of H.J. Res. 2, a proposed constitutional amendment that would effectively overturn the Citizens United decision and permit Congress and the states to regulate campaign finance. Mr. Deutsch, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Before I begin my testimony, Mr. Chairman, I ask the following documents be included into the record. Written testimony of bipartisan advocates from around the country, including Jeff Clement, President of American Promise, John Pudner, the Executive Director of Take Back Our Republic, Jim Rubins, the former Republican New Hampshire State Senator, as well as business executives, farmers, educators, health workers from Ohio, New Jersey, Michigan, California, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Kansas. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee. It has been 10 years since the Supreme Court's disastrous decision in Citizens United, and I am here today to call for a constitutional amendment to overturn it. In the 5-4 majority opinion, Justice Anthony Kennedy dismissed concerns about corruption caused by limitless spending. He wrote, quote, "The appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy, but it has. The decision knocked down long-standing bipartisan campaign finance laws. Now, there are 3 primary problems that have crystallized in the Citizens United decade. First, extreme election spending destroys any hope of political equality in America. Second, current disclosure and anti-coordination rules have not prevented corruption or stopped foreign interference. And third, very few, very wealthy individuals have extraordinary influence. Government institutions too often focus on their pet projects rather than on the public will. Citizens United unleashed a torrent of billions of dollars into our elections. In the 20 years before the Citizens United decision, $750 million of outside spending. In the 10 years since, over $4.5 billion. Dark money groups are not required to disclose their donors. Their spending jumped from $129 million in the 10 years before the decision to $1 billion since. The 10 families who spent the most in our elections in the Citizens United decade spent a total of $1.2 billion. Now, to put that in perspective, it would take 6 million Americans spending $200 each to match the spending of these 10 families. This flood of spending has distorted the agenda in Congress, and we now know that it is sapping America's faith in our democracy and our government. 84% of Americans think that special interests come first here. Last year, the House passed the For the People Act and the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and these bills would require disclosure and end gerrymandering and make it easier to vote and protect voting rights. But statutory changes alone can't fix the problems created by Citizens United. The Democracy for All amendment would allow reasonable limits on campaign spending. Americans want to get big money out of our elections. The amendment rejects the Supreme Court's claim that only quid pro quo bribes can corrupt politicians. Our amendment would level the playing field. It would promote political equality, and it would protect the integrity of our government institutions and elections. I want to thank the millions of advocates and hundreds of organizations who built the movement to get money out of politics. 20 states and over 800 local governments are calling for a constitutional amendment, and we wouldn't be here today without them. I want to thank Vice Chair Raskin, Representative McGovern, Representative Katko, Senators Udall and Shaheen for joining me in introducing this bipartisan amendment. And I want to thank the 210 co-sponsors, including Congresswoman Jayapal and many members of this subcommittee for their support. And to be clear, this issue is not partisan among the American people. In 2018, the University of Maryland reported that 75% of Americans, 3/4 of all Americans, support a constitutional amendment to allow for limits on election spending. That includes 85% of Democrats, 70% of independents, and 2/3 of Republicans. We must overturn Citizens United to fulfill the ideals we affirmed at our nation's founding. The Democracy for All amendment is necessary because your status in our democracy should not depend upon your status in our economy. Whether you work 3 jobs and barely get by, or you own 3 homes and you barely work, the eyes of our law, the eyes of our government, our elections, must see all Americans as equal. This amendment will get money out of our elections, and most importantly, it will put voters back in charge. With that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Very well timed and very well delivered. Ms. Jayapal is next. Representative Pramila Jayapal has been a leader in Congress on many, many progressive issues. She represents the 7th Congressional District of Washington State. She's a member of the House Judiciary Committee, where she sits on the Immigration and Antitrust Subcommittees, serves as senior whip for the Democratic Caucus, and co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and the Women's Working Group on Immigration. She's the sponsor of H.J. Res. 48, a proposed constitutional amendment providing that the rights protected by the Constitution of the United States are the rights protected of natural persons only. Congressman Jayapal, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify on my bill, House Joint Resolution 48, the We the People Amendment. 10 years ago, the Supreme Court issued in its 5-4 landmark ruling in Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commission. The implications of Citizens United reach far beyond electoral politics and political donations. It has had a profound impact on our elections, our policymaking, and our daily lives. And that is why I'm proud to sponsor HJ Res 48, the We the People Amendment, a comprehensive solution to the Citizens United decision. Corporations and the few ultra-rich have hijacked our elections for far too long. The We the People Amendment would put power back to everyday people by ending corporate personhood and clarifying that money does not equal free speech. Citizens United established political spending as protected speech under the First Amendment of the Constitution and further prevented the government from limiting corporations and other entities from spending money on candidates in elections. This established a dangerous precedent of corporate personhood that the We the People Amendment reverses by specifying that the rights provided by the Constitution are for real people, individuals, not corporations. The Supreme Court's decision empowered the Federal Elections Commission to allow outside groups to accept unlimited political donations, giving corporations and the ultra-rich unrestricted power in elections. This created an enormous imbalance in power in which the average American's ability to influence elected officials is dwarfed by large corporations. As we in Congress grapple with critical issues such as climate change, immigration, and an inequitable health care system, we must recognize the power that those with financial stakes in these industries, such as the oil and gas, private prison, and insurance companies, exert in our elections. The We the People Amendment would regulate political donations and mandate public disclosure to ensure transparency and public accountability. Yet the impact of Citizens United is not limited to the role of money in politics. The freedom of expression granted to corporations in Citizens United led to the decision in Hobby Lobby v. Sebelius. The court granted a corporation the ability to opt out of provisions of the Affordable Care Act in order to deny basic health care to women employees on the basis that a corporation has religious liberty. It puts corporate rights over a woman's right to make decisions about her own body. And it is one more reason why we must limit corporate personhood beyond elections. Research has found, as my colleague Mr. Deutsch said, that 77% of Americans believe that there should be limits on the amount that both individuals and groups can spend on campaigns. The time has come for Congress to intervene. I am a proud co-sponsor of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, and of Congressman Deutsch's Democracy for All amendment. I believe that Congress and the states must do the important work of regulating campaign contributions and distinguishing between people and corporations when creating campaign finance legislation. The We the People Amendment goes further to end corporate constitutional rights and ensure that our democracy is really of the people, by the people, and for the people. I believe our democratic values are worth more than what corporations can pay. In the Citizens United dissenting opinion, Justice Stevens wrote, "Corporations have no consciences, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, no desires. Corporations help structure and facilitate the activities of human beings, to be sure, and their personhood often serves as useful legal fiction. But they are not themselves members of we the people, by whom and for whom our Constitution was established. As members of Congress, we are here to serve the people, not to serve corporations. We are here to ensure that our democracy is sustained by we the people, and that we in Congress, the elected members, elected by our constituents, must listen only to we the people. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to reverse the harmful impacts of Citizens United and advance the goals set forth in this amendment, and I thank the movement around the country that has forced us to take on this issue. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jayapal, for your representation, your testimony. We will have the first panel thank them for their testimony and their work and dismiss them, and call up our second panel of witnesses.